All right, let's dive into all those hip mobility exercises that we gotta do every single day. After 10 minutes of hip mobility exercises, now my hip actually feels more stiff and it feels worse. If this is you browsing the internet looking for hip mobility exercises and you're wondering if this is actually good or bad for my hip, well, stay tuned because during this entire video, we're gonna break down whether you should be doing these types of exercises or not. What's up, Rehab? Dr. Craig Lindell here, and we're back with another episode on YouTube, and we're talking about all things mobility. So we're guilty of it. We post mobility exercises all the time. We have over the past few years, but there's also so many scenarios where certain people should not be doing mobility exercises. And today we're going to be talking about hip mobility specifically. So before we even get to the hip, let's talk about the word mobility, right? The word mobility is the ability to move free or be moved freely anywhere. When it comes to the human body and we're talking about mobility, well, we're talking about joints. So in this scenario, the hip, we're talking about how well can the hip joint move. Can it move through hip flexion? Can it move through extension? And all the different motions that it has, which we will cover in this video today. But with that being said, there's two scenarios more often than not when people want to dive into mobility exercises. Number one is pain. And maybe they want to dive into mobility exercises because they believe or they've been told that they need to work on their mobility. And that may be true. There are people out there that are just stiffer than others. And if you're stiff in certain areas and you're not moving well enough at your hip, well, you may be moving too much at your low back. You may be moving too much at your knee. So you're going to work on hip mobility exercises so that you're not moving too much at the wrong areas and you can start moving more at the right area. Now, other scenario, your hip hurts, you think you need hip mobility exercises, but the reality is that you are perceiving stiffness, you are perceiving tightness, and that's because your body is actually trying to hold on. It's trying to tell you not to move too much at your hip. And this scenario tends to be the case a lot in very flexible people, yogis. You know, we always see people that are super flexible and they're like, oh, I just feel stiff. I need to do more mobility exercises. And that's just not the case. So for example, I've been dealing with some hip pain here and there and my left hip was feeling stiff, but I want to show you something. Check this out. So as a PT, when we're evaluating someone's hip, one nice test that we can do is we can have the person lay flat on their back. We say, hey, go ahead, cross your foot across the other knee. Now go ahead, straighten out your knee. This is an easy way to do it on your own. Be mindful of your hip bones. Keep these level, keep these parallel. While keeping that in position, let your right knee fall out as far as you can. We're looking at the mobility and flexibility of structures in front of the right hip. And that includes muscles, tendons, ligaments, and the joint capsule. So take a look at where this is on my right side. That's about as far as I want to go. Now, let's take a look at the other side. So again, I told you my left hip was feeling stiff. Well, if I want and I just let this drop down, you can see I'm keeping these as best as I can leveled. Well, look how much further my left knee goes. So in reality, I don't need more mobility in my left hip. My left hip is craving stability. And my brain is telling my body, stop stretching your hip, stop moving your hip so much. So when I sit down and I'm chilling and I start to feel that perceived stiffness and tightness, that's my body telling me to do something, not mobility, but stability. So let's dive into what those stability exercises look like. Stop scrolling. Stop looking for more mobility exercises. We just talked about this. Literally, this is the stuff that's constantly getting pumped out, but you're not even second guessing if you should be doing it or not. So we just talked about how you can assess your hip mobility, for example, and more importantly, you can kind of problem solve Do you actually need mobility? Are you typically a stiff person that deals with issues that arise from stiffness? Or are you super flexible? Are you constantly stretching? Are you constantly doing mobility stuff, but realizing that you kind of feel worse after? So work through those two problems, check your hip mobility, and now let's talk about this specific stretch. So this half kneeling hip flexor stretch, everyone tends to really exaggerate the position and the motions, but take a look here. We already just learned that I have plenty of mobility in the front of my hip. I'm not stretching my hip flexors at this point. I'm stretching my anterior hip capsule, I'm stretching the anterior hip ligaments, and I'm just probably aggravating and pissing off my hip flexor tendon, that proximal tendon here. So this is not a good mobility exercise for myself, and more importantly, it's probably not a great mobility exercise for anyone who's super flexible and they're dealing with hip-related pain, anterior pain. So instead of doing mobility, you need to do hip flexor stability exercises, which we're gonna get into in a moment. But before we get there, I'm gonna cover another super common and popular hip mobility exercise that probably I personally shouldn't be doing and anyone else with anterior hip pain that shouldn't be doing. So let's cover just the butterfly stretch. Does this look familiar to the position earlier in the video? If you were to just rewind, we're going into hip external rotation, hip abduction. We're stretching our adductors, but we're also stretching that anterior, medial, the in front and inside of our hip capsule. I don't need this. I have plenty of it, right? This one kind of on social media, right? But here's another one that is just death for my hip right now, where we get into these 90-90s, and then I go here, and if I'm just like, oh, just let me lean into this, let me really stretch the back of my left hip. Well, guess what? If you're dealing with any FAI symptoms, hip impingement, femoral acetabular impingement syndrome, well, yes, your hip is still, but you're moving your pelvis on your hip. And all you're doing is bringing bones and anatomy closer to one another. You're getting into a closed packed position, closed packed on the joint, adding more pressure to it, bringing objects closer to one another. All you're doing is pissing stuff off, and you're poking the bruise, you're poking the bear. So again, question all these mobility drills. But instead of just me sitting here pointing the finger telling you what not to do, let me give you some actionable things that specifically I'm doing in my programming that is making my hip feel so much better. So number one, instead of doing this stretch, instead of just hanging out on your hip flexor in those passive structures, let's work our hip flexor actively and work on stability. I'm going to show you 3 easy exercises that you can do with literally no equipment. You just need your body and you need some desire to want to put in the work. So get into a plank position. Now I know this looks straightforward, right? But the minute that you go to lift one leg and you hold, if I'm not using my hip flexor, I'm going to sink down into hip extension. My pelvis is going to drop down. So here I go to lift my right foot, and boy, do I feel my left quad and my left hip flexor working. And I then just go to switch. The minute that we do any kind of hip, pelvic exercise and we add in a unilateral emphasis, one leg lifting, one leg holding still, now we're adding in other planes of motion. So not only am I focused on maintaining position, but on limiting rotating. So that's a great way to work on hip stability with just your body weight. And trust me, if you're dealing with hip issues, you will notice and you will feel a difference on that hip that's giving you trouble. Now, instead of stretching my groin with that butterfly stretch or whatever it is you found on social media that's telling you to get out into this crazy position, why don't we work our adductor? So how do you do that? Well, guess what? Let's just get into a side plank, but set up your feet where you're in this heel toe position. I really like to focus on positioning. Make sure that you feel really strong and stable. Your elbows set up under your shoulder, strong through your shoulder girdle, strong in your abs, your internal obliques on this side. And now, pick up that right foot, hold for a few seconds, bring it back, and repeat. If you're feeling strong you can just hold this position, right? So now we're working the muscles that are on the inside of my thigh. If those muscles were to relax, I would just drop down. So a great way to work the inside of your thigh, work those adductors, and now you're limiting excessive abduction. More importantly, the last exercise that I want to give you, if you're dealing with any issues in your hip, we live a life that's very sagittal plane focused. Walking straight and back, standing, sitting, the frontal plane is where we need to work on issues. So if you get anterior hip pain with anything in this line, straightforward, linear, sagittal, then you need to take a look at your frontal plane, motion and stability, as well as your rotation, mobility and stability. So it's an easy way to do this. You'll notice it side to side for me. I kid you not, I'm doing this like 4 days a week. So get back into that side plank position, but now lift the top leg. Either just hold it or drop it down, do reps. But if I were to just collapse, it's this position. So it's too much adduction, bringing my leg in. And what's that a problem with? Well, if my leg comes in too much, my pelvis collapses on my femur, then it's that abutment. Bones are hitting one another, closed pack position, hip impingement, proximal adductor tendinopathy. It's just not going to feel good. So my left side is getting better, but my right side, I can literally just hang out here all day. It's easy. The limiting factor is I feel this. This doesn't feel good holding. So I got my homework that I need to work on. You're now going to be the most skeptical person doom scrolling on social media, avoiding mobility drills. But again, it all depends, right? Mobility, just second guess it, but it's not as clear cut as you think. You got to learn, what does your body need versus what does your body have too much of? And that's where it really comes down to get help from a professional or reach out to us. We got over 30 programs at this point that we can point you in the right direction. And more importantly, within all those programs, we're kind of telling you what to be mindful of, what to focus more energy and attention on versus maybe you need less of it. So hope you enjoyed this episode. A little bit different than what we usually do, but at the same time, we have way more YouTube episodes like this. So please give us feedback. Let us know what you see, what you want to see more of, what you don't care for as much. And please hit the subscribe button. All right, until next time, I gotta go do more of my hip homework.